right. Next is a sharing about Route to Net Zero by Ms. Xinying Tok, Head of Southeast Asia Carbon Trust. She has over 12 years of experience working as a banker, an ESG consultant, and a philanthropic grantmaker in Southeast Asia and China. Xinying currently leads and grows the Carbon Trust team in Singapore to be the trusted and expert net zero guide for business, governments, and organizations across Southeast Asia. She's going to touch on the topic, learn from the sustainability strategies of climate leaders within and outside the industry, and how semiconductor companies can advance their transition into a net zero future through transparency, collaboration, and innovation. So without further ado, I'll hand over the stage time to Xinying Tok, talking about Route to Net Zero. And over to you. Joe, give a big hand as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much. Very glad this morning to be at this event, and thanks to the chairman, Wong, as well as Chairman Andrew and Executive Director Ang for inviting the Carbon Trust to be here to talk a little bit about how other companies have taken the route to net zero, why they have started on this journey, and how we see the semiconductor industry in Singapore being able to also accelerate its journey towards net zero. So while we have understood and learned about the impacts of climate change for a very long time, the world was actually galvanized into action only in 2015, so not such a long time ago. The Paris Agreement set a target for governments, businesses like yourselves, as well as society at large, to try to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, but also pursue the efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Why the difference, we might say? The 0.5 degrees difference actually does mean huge and large impacts on economies, future growth, as well as human lives. So with the strong research backing of the IPCC report in 2018, there was a lot of effort to look at net zero defined by the 1.5 degrees target. And since then, it's not only governments that have taken up this challenge. Companies, as well as investors, have taken up this challenge as they start to realize the existential threat that can really befall us as a human society, and be able to then take responsibility to be able to direct the right types of capital to the right types of solutions. We have also seen many companies that you might regard as household names coming up with very strong commitments and acknowledging that these commitments need to come with strong follow-through. Companies like Hyundai, HP, Apple, the cars that we drive, the computers that we use, the smartphones that we hold on to every day, they are also based out of the foundational technology of the semiconductor industry. They are facing the pressures to look at net zero and also taking the responsibility to look at net zero. Starting on this sustainability journey might be very complicated for many companies, right? I think today what I wanted to demonstrate is that as a consulting and advisory firm, the Carbon Trust has helped companies look at existing frameworks, existing tools to help them start on this journey, but also accelerate themselves along this journey. So first, in terms of communication and sustainability frameworks, I think many of us are quite familiar with the names and the alphabets that are being thrown around: UN SDG, GRI, SASB. They are quite complicated. Why are they complicated? Because we don't live in a silo, right? We operate in the social system, we operate in the natural environment system. Some of these changes might flow through the financial system, but effectively, we have to think about everyone in our stakeholder groups: the workers, the society, and the natural capital that we rely on. So being able to use these frameworks to help yourself analyze where could be hotspots Depending on where you are on the value chain in the semiconductor industry, it might be different. But using these frameworks helps you to start thinking about what the hotspots are, so you can start using the right metrics to measure your own progress, and then start thinking about how you integrate this into strategy. And that's the most important part, right? Taking the metrics that come out of this process and thinking about what does this mean for my business. And there are more tools that have been developed out there, specific to climate change, specific to decarbonization. The Climate Disclosure Project, CDP, as well as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, they are both organizations that have created accounting methodologies or questionnaires that help us think about this question in a more specific climate-related manner. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol is an accounting standard for different parts of your value chain. So it helps you understand what is Scope 1, what is Scope 2, what is Scope 3. And some of this depends on where is your operational control for you to reduce your carbon in the first place. Climate Disclosure Project is another tool that enables you to take some of these metrics and ask yourself some of the business strategy questions around risks and opportunities. But we have gone even further than that now. There are now other frameworks and other tools out there to help us even target net zero. So for example, the Science Based Targets Initiative, an organization that comes together to try to plot out the right type of pathways for every industry to take if we were to be able to target 1.5 degrees warming in the world. The Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures is an interesting framework that put in place in 2017. And it's important because it connects the governance of a company all the way to strategy, all the way to metrics. So we're now no longer talking about how do you count your carbon footprint. We're talking about how do you govern and make decisions and change your strategy once you know what your carbon footprint is. But the TCFD also has a different view of this. It talks about climate risks, climate opportunities, and every different industry faces it in different ways, right? I think the important part of having a TCFD is because it classifies the risks and opportunities into ways that can be understood and translated in different types of mitigation strategies and different types of business strategies. When you look at the risks framework, for example, there's transition risks. And transition risk can come about from regulatory change, that could be from carbon tax, or very specifically, when we start thinking about no sales from diesel and petrol vehicles, right? So there will be a big move towards electric vehicles. So those are regulatory type changes that leads to transition risks. There can be technology change. 5 years ago, when TCFD was first put in place, we would never have imagined electric HDV vehicles on the street. They are now running more than pilots. They are commercially running on the streets. So technology change can move way faster than we had imagined it before, and companies that have looked specifically in where those risks might come from can be ahead of the game. Consumer risks, I think just now many of the speakers have alluded to the younger generation really thinking about what does it mean for them in the future, and therefore changing their consuming practices because of that. But the other large part of the TCFD risks framework is the physical risk framework. And I believe the physical risk framework is something that is much harder for businesses to contemplate with because of the rapidly changing realities of extreme weather. I think just now Russell mentioned about ponding from 10 years ago and how that has changed from just irregular ponding to very, very regular extreme weather. In Singapore, we don't really see it as extreme weather, right? We see it as longer periods of rain and then longer periods of dryness. But in many different parts of the world, where the semiconductor industry and your consumers are, they are really affecting supply chains. Last year in Texas, there was a really, really big winter storm. In that winter storm, pipes burst. Blackouts happened. The semiconductor industry players there had to stop production. This year in Malaysia, the floods, yes, it has displaced 60,000 people, it has killed 27, but it has also shut down a semiconductor plant with possible impacts of up to $28 million. This year as well, in Sichuan in China, the opposite of flooding, heat waves, just about the same time. Because Sichuan was so hot, the electricity had to really be controlled. In order to ensure residential supply, businesses and factories was asked to shut down. So the physical impacts are becoming very, very salient. The transition risk impacts, as we all know, the carbon tax regimes, the carbon pricing regimes are really coming on board. The investors want companies to demonstrate a strong understanding of this, a strong governance of this, and a strong way to respond to this. Mitigation of these risks is one end of it. More and more so, investors, together with the governments, as well as the consumers, are starting to ask for companies to be participating in the solution and to really accelerate their goal of decarbonization. So at the Carbon Trust, over the last 20 years, we have helped about 3,000 organizations across companies and governments to think about net zero. What is their journey towards net zero? And we recognize that this is a very difficult journey. We have supported some of the tools and frameworks because we know that companies need some guidance. For example, we have co-authored the Scope 3 guidance under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. We have created the first product carbon footprint because we understand that companies that really put their efforts need to be rewarded and need to have visibility of their efforts. And lastly, as the Science-Based Target Initiative grew, we are also members of the technical board that helps to look at what is the right way to set targets so that we can achieve our 1.5 degrees target. And because of the 20 years of work that we have done, we have long-standing relationships and have seen our companies that work with us through this journey. How do they use some of these frameworks and some of these target setting tools to enable themselves to reach a net zero future? Carlsberg, one of our long-standing customers, they have a very strong net zero target. We've supported them to become one of the first 1.5 degrees aligned SBT compliant companies. But before all of this, they were also participants in CDP reporting, which helps them understand where their risks and opportunities are. They also do annual TCFD reporting. And even before that, they have worked on energy efficiency initiatives. They have worked to turn their electricity into renewable energy. And they have also continued to work beyond their own operational scope, beyond their value chain, to start looking at innovative packaging, to start looking at low carbon transport. Siemens is one of our pathfinder pioneers in the new standard called the Route to Net Zero standard. It is a standard that recognizes that everybody starts somewhere in this journey, and it doesn't matter where you start. What's important is that we see this progress, and this progress a lot of times is internal. Some of the change management that needs to happen internally. How do you enable that to happen? How do you get recognized for the efforts that you have made step by step? Again, Siemens also has a very strong net zero goal. It also has an SBTi 1.5 target approved. So now in Southeast Asia, there are 2,000 over companies around the world with science-based targets. There are some in Southeast Asia. There are about 80 of them. So Southeast Asia is still on its way to understanding what does it mean for companies to set science-based targets. But here in Singapore, we actually have leaders in different industries that have found their way and their pathway and their journey towards net zero and will be finding their pathways towards SBTi 1.5 degrees compliant. For example, Singtel. For example, CDL. I think in the building space, CDL has looked beyond its value chain in Scope 3 as embodied carbons, set targets around that. Singtel has done the same. So how about the semiconductor industry? where are some of the leaders? Who are some of the leaders? And what are the types of targets they have in mind? How will this flow through to the supply chain? And how will you have to be able to enable this change to happen together as an industry? We see Intel, TSMC, AMD, Applied Materials, they all have SBT targets and net zero targets. Samsung as well. And just a little pitch, Samsung is also using the Carbon Trust product footprinting label to help to tell the story to its consumers about the efforts they are making in climate change. But why? Why does the semiconductor industry really need to step up now? When we look at this chart, this is basically the CO2 emissions that are within the operational control of companies. We look at mapping Intel, TSMC, and GM. And we start to see that chip producers are rapidly overtaking even the automakers as polluters in this industry, right? And yet, at the same time, to enable the electric vehicle future, to enable a renewable energy future, the chip industry does need to grow. How do you grapple with this, right? The ICT industry now accounts for 2 to 3% of worldwide greenhouse gas emissions, but then right now, the potential of reduction is only 17%. We have a really, really long way to go. How can the semiconductor industry pull together, use the core of innovation that has always been there to turn this story around and be strong contributors to net zero? We want to talk about 3 main ways. First, the level of transparency. Why is transparency important? Transparency is important because the reporting frameworks, even though they are complicated, they actually allow you to spend critical amount of time thinking about where are the hotspots, finding the hotspots where you can direct your energies to. And then when you report, it enables investors to have the information needed for make informed decisions, as more and more of them have net zero portfolio targets. It also enables yourself, your investors, and your stakeholders to track progress, increase trust in this progress, and also increasingly increase your brand reputation. Second, collaboration. I think throughout the industry there has been collaboration in many different ways, but we want to talk about collaboration specifically about decarbonization. Why? Because for every single player within one part of the value chain in the industry, most of your footprint might be outside of your operational control, right? When we start thinking about the importance of looking at Scope 3 emissions, it means that you have to work upstream and downstream to ensure that you are all moving together in this decarbonization journey. And we have seen some of the leaders talk about that, right? We have seen Lam Research, we have seen AMD. In their own plans to reach decarbonization, they have set targets for how their suppliers will also have decarbonization targets. We have also seen a different type of collaboration, working with startups, looking for startups to help see how they can contribute into your processes in terms of decarbonization. Lastly, innovation. I think there was so much that was already said in innovation today. I think it's the core of the semiconductor industry, and there's already been so much technical innovation that's focused on the energy efficiency of chips in the design process, in the architecture. I think what I wanted to talk about was this innovation needs to happen at every single part of the life cycle. Right? And we do see that that's already happening. We do see organizations and companies on the product design side really trying to reduce energy efficiency of the product. We do see companies looking at raw material sourcing, reducing energy use in their manufacturing processes, end-of-life treatment. How will you think about that? How will you think about circular models in the semiconductor industry? But there are also other parts of this life cycle that we need to think about. The transportation phase, the use phase. And I think as pointed out just now, there will be innovations and investments into electrification of vehicles, into different ways of inter-country trade type of, whether it's shipping, whether it's aviation, and all of that contributes to a reduction of your transport phase emissions. Use phase emissions. The level of efficiency of the chips and what you can do with it is a very important part of that process. But at the same time, does increased efficiency also lead to increased use? Can we think about how the industry as a whole has a message around reducing use phase emissions? One very important tool to enable us to think about where you should put in your energies across all of these life cycle stages is the life cycle analysis. I think it was mentioned just now before, an example, Apple as an example of looking at its life cycle emission of its phone. A large part of that life cycle, including looking at use phase, is actually in the manufacturing. And if you can see here, it's actually in the integrated circuit. So you can see that Apple has looked into this, and then there's a reason why they have now committed to full recyclability in their production systems, right? Because they now understand that this is where the most impactful change can happen. They can work with their suppliers to enable that change to happen. So embedding circular economy will become one of the most important things in this industry, thinking about how do we reduce and how do we decarbonize. There are many other companies that are making strong efforts in this space. I think the industry definitely can come together to think about how each part of the value chain can contribute to a circular economy. Lastly, I want to talk about the paradox and therefore the challenge for the semiconductor industry. On the climate side, I've worked in renewable energy space, I've worked in electric vehicle space, I've worked in building energy. All of these reduction possibilities and reduction potentials are highly reliant on digitization and automation. The chip industry's contribution to the society's change and the society's future of a sustainable future is very, really important. It's the foundation of that change. If the semiconductor industry wants to contribute to the climate crisis in the most impactful manner, it will have to look at its own carbon footprint as it tries to enable all of us to have a sustainable future. At the end of the day, can we look at carbon footprint as one of the key optimization targets in the product life cycle? Can we start thinking about that all the way from product design phase all the way to the end of life phase? That would be how the semiconductor industry can really rise to this challenge of supporting our sustainable future in the most sustainable way possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Xinying. We do have some questions for you on Slido. Okay, for a company that has already established its baseline footprint and declared its net zero target, what can be done to reach the net zero target?
Great, thank you. I think, as I mentioned just now, the first step is the footprint, right? Because you can't manage anything that you cannot understand. So once you have that footprint and you want to think about your net zero target, we will first need to do a little bit of a hotspot analysis, right? Where is this coming from? Which part of your life cycle is it coming from? And when we think about that, sometimes the most difficult part to understand is your scope 3. A very typical way of doing a scope 3 analysis is to use a dollar-based, spend-based analysis, when actually, in order for you to really identify your hotspots for reduction, you might have to look at it with life cycle analysis, with do a proper life cycle analysis to be able to identify the right hotspots. And then usually the levers of change, And we talk about this in a very carbon reduction framing, right? But of course, within a company, there's also a lot of change management that really needs to take place. Being able to create the right type of governance structures to be able to enable that decision making and the right type of capital expenditure direction to go to. Having a very strong growth in strong thought processes around where do you place your sustainability team to enable them to be able to galvanize this action. All of it comes together to the types of levers that are actually available to you, right? The energy efficiency lever and then the transition of energy to renewable energy lever are both very important to think about at the same time. For a semiconductor industry, because there's so many different types of players across the value chain, it's quite hard to currently say which one is a more important part of that. But when we looked at some of the leading players, a large part of between 30 to 60% of their footprint is actually in scope 3. And that's part of the reason why it's important when you set a net zero target, include the scope 3, and to be starting to work together with your partners in your value chain to reduce those emissions as well.
Thank you, Xinying, for answering. Let's take one more question. What are some quick wins for a semiconductor company to decarbonize their footprint? Yes, you can view the questions right there as well.
I think quick wins, this journey is difficult. I like to make sure that we don't think about it as quick wins. I like to suggest that we think about this as a systemic type of change that happens internally in a company, and the ability to use some of these frameworks to be able to build the type of systemic change that needs to happen within the company about how you think about product design, how do you think about process engineering, how do you think about every single step of the way. I think quick wins right now go the short distance, but will not be able to enable us to reach the net zero future.
All right, thank you very much, Xinying. Okay, well, that will be the last question for today, but I'm sure they have more questions for you. They probably grab you during the breaks at the exhibition area. Thank you very much for your presentation. Once again, a big round of applause for Ms. Xinying Tok. Route to Net Zero. Thank you so much once again.